Welcome everyone to the webinar on Carrots in History, History in Carrots by Philip Simon and Susanna Cabrera-Mariz. I'm your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. This presentation will last between 45 minutes and an hour, and then we'll have 30 minutes for audience questions. Philip Simon is a USDA Agricultural Research Service geneticist, and he's a professor of horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research on carrot and garlic genetics and breeding is conducted to improve these crops for growers and consumers. Susanna Cabrera-Mariz is a research and education associate at the Organic Seed Alliance in Washington State, and she also has a master's degree in anthropology focused on seeds, culture, and public education from Iowa State University. And we're all collaborating on the Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture project, which is funded by NIFA OREI. So I've been really excited about this webinar for the past maybe 5 years or so, and now we're finally able to present it. So without any more delay, I'm going to turn off my video and then give Phil the remote control here, and then we'll get started.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Alice. I appreciate it. Very glad to talk to you today about carrots, and in particular carrots in history and history in carrots, to give you some background on where today's carrots came from, how they got there, and how we've decided that what some of these answers to some of these questions are with some of the activities and travels that have been underway. So just to give some background to the talk, to talk about why it's important to be thinking about the historical story of carrots, because it is useful, because the historical development of all crops in agriculture can help us better understand not only the crops, but also the places, people, in the process of domestication that led to the crops that we have today. And the diversity of the crops that maybe have been important as the crop was being domesticated. So if we look at domestication more generally, it's widely accepted that wheat, barley, and sheep were first domesticated from their wild relatives in the Fertile Crescent about 10 to 12,000 years ago, and also somewhat independently in other parts of the world, where other domestications taking place. Maize was domesticated a little more recently, and rice 9 to 10,000 years ago in the Americas and in Asia, respectively. And so if we look at some of these wild relatives of wheat and maize in this photo, the wild relatives on the top, and needless to say, the cultivated modern versions in the lower parts of these pictures, you see the comparison between the wild and domesticated versions of wheat and corn. We've got a good history for those two crops. We don't have very much history, relatively speaking, about the origins of carrot as a cultivated crop compared to its wild relative. And so you see wild carrots on the left here and a modern cultivar today on the right. So to take a look at this question of the domestication of carrots, there's a couple of approaches to it. One is to answer the question, where do the wild relatives of carrot come from? Because domestication always starts with a wild relative that's been brought into cultivation with this domestication process. And so looking at wild relatives, I'll give a couple of slides talking about carrot germplasm resources, what those are and what that means to this whole process. After that, I'll give you some background on the historical record of the cultivated carrot crop, the written historical records, which are relatively scant, and the appearance of carrot in art, in historical botanical treatises, and in iconography. So taking a look at these two questions, first, I want to give you some background on what I was, maybe go back briefly in this first question, carrot germplasm resources, and as it relates to wild relatives of carrot. So carrot germplasm resources, or germplasm resources more generally, refer to the hereditary material of a plant species and its wild relatives. Typically, we think of those primarily as seeds in plants, but also pollen and even DNA can be regarded as germplasm resources. These resources are important for not only studying domestication, which I'm going to particularly focus on today, but they're also the starting materials for crop improvement and carrot improvement in the case of my topic for today. So if we look more broadly at this thing we call carrots, it's part of the genus Daucus, the species Carota, and the cultivated version is referred to as Daucus carota subspecies sativus or sativus. And those domesticated carrots of the sativus type are generally broken into about three different groups, one being the current breeding stocks or the modern cultivars, the varieties we're familiar with, then some of the older heirloom varieties that maybe not are widely known, but are still preserved in sources of seed with different collections of seed from around the world. And then even more unique carrots often, which are landraces, which are locally bred and grown cultivars of carrots that only maybe ever occurred in one small geographic part of the world. So in order to access this germplasm, you have to do some traveling, which I'll talk about later on. So that's the cultivated part of Daucus carota. The other part of it is wild carrot, which is primarily Daucus carota subspecies carota, and that's commonly known as Queen Anne's lace, which I'll show you in the next couple of slides, but also a few other subspecies. But Daucus carota subspecies carota is the most widely distributed. In addition to these closer relatives of carrots, which incidentally are all intercrossable with carrots, cultivated carrots, there are about 40 other Daucus species, the same genus as carrot, in the Apiaceae or the umbelliferae family of plants. And of particular interest are three species that have the same chromosome number of carrots, which means we might be able to make intercrosses between those species and carrots, which we have some work underway. That so far we haven't definitely done that, but it's of interest. So that covers the closest relatives of carrots in the genus Daucus, the species Carota, and then there's these other Daucus species. So if we looking a little more further at these apiaceous or Daucus crops, most of the Daucus species occur around the Mediterranean Sea, both the northern Africa as well as southern Europe and the Fertile Crescent I talked about earlier. And so, again, most of those 40 species, including most of the Daucus species that are subspecies of Carota, occur around the Mediterranean. In contrast, Daucus carota occurs more widely in contrast to most of the other Daucus species. So again, the black circle is most of the Daucus species. The orange circle is the center of diversity for carrot, meaning that's where when we collect wild carrots and looked at wild carrots from across this whole part of the world, the greatest amount of genetic diversity we find based on molecular evaluations in particular are those carrots that show up in this area of the Central Asia, which is that orange circle. So places like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And one little wild carrot picture in the corner. I'll hold off for answering carrots questions until later on, but please keep asking them. So that's a quick background of where carrots and its immediate relatives occur in this Central Asia to Mediterranean region. But wild carrot, Daucus carota, subspecies carota, in fact, occurs much more widely than this area of northern Africa, all of Europe, much of Asia, but also in the U.S. So this is a roadside picture here in Madison, Wisconsin, with some wild carrots, some germplasm growing along the roadside next to a cornfield here in Wisconsin. And in fact, wild carrot can be found in many parts of the world where there's enough water and a relatively temperate climate where these wild relatives can grow and reproduce. And so looking at this process of how the wild relatives became cultivated and domesticated is the next topic I'll be looking at. And it's an interesting and useful topic to look at because it provides historical insights not only into the crop use, but also some inspiration or perhaps a better term would be some motivation for incorporating some of this variation we see in the crop in the current and ongoing breeding and improvement of the crop, using some of that genetic diversity for improving the crop in the same way that our ancestors domesticated the crop and looked at that diversity to make a crop that was able to be cultivated. So if we look at this domestication process, it all starts with wild carrots. And in the upper left-hand picture here, it's a vacant lot in Middleton, Wisconsin, just down the road from me here in Madison. And this is early part of the year, and lots of wild carrots growing in this vacant lot. And if it was left to go to seed, it would look like the picture below, which is actually a vacant lot in at the edge of a village in Tunisia where I was collecting some carrots. You can't see much there other than a bunch of brown plants. Those are dried carrot plants, and they're covered with carrot seed, and they would be very much spreading that seed and reproducing in that area in the same way that if that vacant lot above was allowed to go to seed would be sharing and spreading a lot of wild carrot seed. We dig up these wild carrots. All the wild carrots I've looked at from around the world are white rooted, sometimes a little hint of purplish color and maybe a little yellow, but certainly no dark color like we're familiar with cultivated carrots and very often with these very sprangled or forked roots. The common name for wild carrots in the English language is often Queen Anne's lace because the carrot flower or umbel, that collection of flowers at the top of these flowering plants in the upper left you see, and also that one plant above the picture of the lace, it looks something like this lace. And so Queen Anne's lace is the common name for wild carrot for many people. And this is wild carrot. So let's take a look at what we know about what the role carrots had in prehistory. And not a lot is known, although it has wild carrot, I would say carrot seed, has been found in campsites as long ago as 5,500 years in Germany and Switzerland. These were found in campsites, thus implying that they were had some human use. It's likely that and thought that these were most likely used as a spice or a medicine or in some herbal form, like other relatives of carrot that I have pictures of seed below, caraway, fennel, coriander, some other spice and medicinal apiaceous or plants and relatives of carrots. And these were very, very likely collected from wild carrots and not cultivated. There's no evidence of them being cultivated, but because these were from a campsite. And again, these roots and seeds were quite certainly used medicinally in ancient Greece and Rome. And there's some written information about that I'll be presenting in the next couple of slides. But at least carrots had been, I will note that since we're seeing evidence for carrots 5,500 years ago in Switzerland and Germany, obviously wild carrot had spread widely from its center of origin in Central Asia that long ago, suggesting that it's been growing as a wild plant for a long time in a very large geographic area. So this slide is very complicated. I'm not going to go through all the details. You'll maybe want to look at it later on if you want to see more of the details. But the first written evidence for the possibility of this thing we call carrots is some Greek literature that might be describing wild carrot as a white or yellow rooted plant about 2,300 years ago, 300 years BCE. Looking ahead beyond that, about 400 years after that, the first century in the Common Era, both Greek and Roman literature had some reference and some images of yellow and maybe orange carrots. There's been some question of whether these ancient writings refer to carrots or parsnips. But in this case, these two evidences I mentioned, these first two lines, are probably carrots. The best evidence coming up for early carrots is from about 1,500 years ago in Rome, where both cultivated and wild carrots were described. Interestingly, they're both colored as being orange. And that's strange to me because I've never seen a wild orange carrot, but that's the way the images show. And the next slide, I'll give you some references to seeing those images. Moving forward more recently to what's regarded as the primary center of domestication of carrots in Central Asia, in particular Afghanistan and its vicinity. Purple and yellow carrots are noted in some of the written literature of that time. Moving further to the west of Central Asia into Iraq and into Iran, there's written evidence of yellow, possibly orange carrots in Iraq. And then again, going further and further west in Iran, in Syria, in Spain even, purple and yellow carrots are noted in some historical writings. Looking at some of the Asian development of carrots about 1200 AD, China has written evidence. There's written evidence in Chinese literature for purple, yellow, and probably red rather than purple carrots as well. First definite evidence for orange carrots shows up in Italy in the 1200s, maybe 1300s, along with purple and yellow. And more recently in the 1300s in France, Germany, Holland. And again, we go northward into Europe, evidence in Spain, Germany, England. I should have included France and Holland in that line as well for 14 and 1500. And in more development of carrots in Asia and Japan. And then finally in the 1600s, orange carrots were pretty much worldwide known, including in North America in the 1600s. And first carrots that had names were long, orange, and horn about in the 1700s, named by the Dutch, who really worked hard in growing and developing orange carrots. And the best written records and reviews of this topic are in these two references at the bottom of the slide. The Solarzik and Janik paper is one I'll talk about in this next slide, where it refers to these images that were found in this text of 300 Common Era and even more ancient than that. And again, some of these show up as orange, and that's a little bit hard to understand, but very clearly they are orange carrots in what we're seeing. So a big part of the understanding of the origins of carrot color do rely on not only written records, but even more so on some of the iconography or the paintings and other artwork of the time. So we see some Italian paintings in the upper left here with an orange carrot on the right below the foot of one of these, I guess, angels, and that carrot is shown down below. And in some Spanish paintings in the 1600s, and a boy holding a carrot in France in the 1700s. And so again, as noted here, the orange color of carrots was greatly determined by the extent of examination of artwork. So to look, my title talks about the history, carrots in history and history in carrots. For the history in carrots in part of this talk, I'm primarily going to cover that in the next couple of slides, where we did a molecular evaluation of wild carrots and cultivated carrots covering much of Europe and Asia that had come from these specific geographic regions. And this gave evidence to the fact that, in fact, most of the molecular diversity for wild carrots is in Central Asia. And the greatest similarity for cultivated carrots from this wide geographic region was also in Central Asia, suggesting that is where the domestication of carrots occurred. For those of you familiar with molecular techniques, that include about 4,000 genetic markers at a structure analysis, and suggesting fairly great retention of diversity in early domestication, at least the carrots. And so this molecular study looking at carrot diversity agrees with the speculations of the larger body of historical records that carrot as a root crop originated in Central Asia 1,100 years ago, although there is this earlier evidence for some carrots in Southern Europe as well. I will note that Vavilov, the famous plant collector, thought that carrot originated in Central Asia as well. So again, I'm not going to go into the molecular analysis any more than to show you this one slide, and these fingers on this diagram show the relationship between, you look at around 1 o'clock on this slide, Western cultivated carrots and their molecular diversity, which is similar to Eastern cultivated carrots as we go around this clock. And the closest wild carrot is the wild carrots of Central Asia, again, suggesting Central Asia is the center of origin of cultivated carrots that we have today. But wild carrots from Greece and Middle East and North Africa are also in this circle, but less related to the cultivated carrots. So that's my brief overview of the history of carrots in history and carrots part of the talk. And it does agree with a lot of the written literature. So the bottom line is that there's a large amount of genetic diversity in this thing we call carrots, and this has been used to develop the modern carrots from wild carrots by our early ancestors in the domestication process. And this brings us to the question, why is it important to be looking at this? And a major part of the answer to that question is it's an important part of what we look at tapping into for future carrot improvement, because that genetic diversity is going to be important to developing new carrots to meet ongoing new challenges to carrot growers, not only today, but as time goes forward. So we asked that I'm not going to talk about it in this talk, but this brings us to the question of what can we do to continue improving carrots to feed the growing populations, and also what future production challenges might there be for growers, and how can this diversity be useful for that group. I'm not going to go into the details of this slide, but it's a brief overview of how some of this genetic diversity has been used to address some modern problems of carrot production. The top part of the picture is the question of how can you develop carrots to make hybrid carrots. In other words, how do you intercross carrots because they have very small flowers and you can't intercross them like you would, say, cucumber or tomato flowers. So it depends on something called cytoplasmic male sterility, and I'll show you a picture of that in the next slide. And wild carrot is where that diversity for developing hybrid carrots comes from. That's a whole separate discussion that I won't go into other than the next slide, but that's been an important contribution of carrot diversity to modern carrot improvement, is the ability to make the hybrids of the crop. In addition to that, wild and heirloom and landrace carrots have been tapped into for improving a range of diseases, from carrot fly resistance to several leaf and root diseases. And again, I'm not going to talk any more about this, but some of this diversity has already been tapped into to look at solving some modern problems. Briefly look at this one important contribution of, in this case, wild carrots to modern carrot production is the development of a carrot flower that can be used to make hybrid carrots. And so a normal carrot flower is in picture A here, where you've got 5 petals and 5 anthers, and the pistil in the middle for seed production. Upper right's a carrot that has the 5 petals and 5 sterile anthers, and so it has no viable pollen. Below is the petaloid type of carrot, where the 5 anthers are replaced by 5 more petals, and so consequently there's no male fertility on that carrot. This is what some of these male sterile carrots look like, and again, this is what's the basis for most of the carrots that you get from large mainstream grocery stores, because these are primarily hybrids, unless you have local cultivars that might be open pollinated from this type of collection of diversity that we see in carrots today. A wide range of colors, shapes, and sizes, as well as flavors and lots of other variation. So we've got all this genetic diversity. It's very important, and we've been doing a lot of studying to see how we can better improve the crop for modern growers and consumers. So let's take a quick, more extensive look at the germplasm that is so valuable, not only to help us understand carrot domestication, but also contribute to crop production and improvement, and talk about carrot collection and collection of that wild carrot germplasm, and also some of the landrace and cultivated carrot. I'm going to give you a very quick overview, some collection of germplasm that I've been involved with, 10 collecting expeditions starting as early as 1989 up until 2016 to about 11 countries where I've been involved in collecting germplasm with a focus on carrots. I'll show you a fair number of photos, but I'll give you the bottom line of what these collecting expeditions amounted to in the bottom of this slide, where we collected about 36 land races, so some local cultivars that weren't in the collection of carrot diversity. That collection, I'll note, is held in Ames, Iowa, but not going to talk more about that. But we collected 36 new land races, added them to the collection, 316 wild carrots of the Carota subspecies, 59 other Docus Carota subspecies, and then several collections from some of these 18 chromosome species that we're hoping might be crossable to carrots, and 280 examples of other Docus species other than Docus Carota. So in overall, over 250 seed samples of carrots and some other vegetables came from these collecting expeditions. Briefly, the places that I've done collecting include, at the time, USSR in 1989. That collection expedition was a result of Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan meeting to open up the collecting opportunities in the Soviet Union. I've also collected in Syria, Turkey, Greece in the late 90s, in Portugal, Uzbekistan, a couple times in Tunisia, and collecting. There's wild relatives of carrot beyond wild carrot in the U.S. And David Spooner and I collected in the U.S. And David and I also in one Tunisian expedition and on a couple of trips to Morocco and a fairly extensive trip where we went to Spain to collect carrot and its wild relatives. So quite a few different carrot accessions from Carota and other species of Docus in those expeditions. I will note that you too can collect germplasm if you're interested. All germplasm is arranged by the USDA National Germplasm Collection Group, and it's curated by the U.S. National Plant Germplasm System. You might know these as plant introductions if you're familiar with that system. The needs for collecting have to be a priority as determined by your germplasm committee, which in the case of carrots is the root and bulb vegetable crop germplasm committee. If that committee says it's important to be collecting carrots or whatever crop you're interested in a certain place, you may be able to get some funding to do the collecting. You want to plan at least an 18-month lead time on doing any collecting. Can include other U.S. international participants on the U.S. side, and always includes a local expert where you're collecting. And there are many places that are not open for collecting, but there are still a few. All the seed that's collected for the U.S. ends up in the U.S. collection, but also half of that seed is left with the local collectors we work with. So we always leave half the seed with that local collector. If you're going to collect, you want to know where the species occur. You can find this information online. If you want to find Docus aureus, it's flowering in June in southern Spain, and in this picture I'm showing you, and Docus muricatus in a similar region, and also Portugal, also in early June. So you need this kind of information if you're going to be collecting germplasm. And when you're done collecting, you want to keep track of where you've collected carrots. And so in our 2009 Tunisian collection, this is where we collected different carrot and its relatives in Tunisia. And 2016 collection expedition, we went quite widely throughout Spain and got germplasm in those black spots on the map to the right on this image. Again, there are both U.S. and international participants in all these collecting expeditions. This is primarily the U.S. part of the collection. Myself here in 1989, along with Leonard Pike and John Swenson, and our local collaborator, Alexandra Pimakoff. here in Leningrad. And 2001, the local specialists, the curators in the middle, Rina Farias, as well as a couple of colleagues from France, Mathilde Briard and Valérie Leclerc, were apparently they're pointing at a wild carrot in Portugal. Barbara Hellier was involved in a collecting expedition we had in 2004. Barbara was with the USDA in Pullman, Washington, and was a very important collaborator all along the way as we've gone through the carrot collecting process. David Spooner is my colleague, now deceased, but was an important contributor to carrot taxonomy and also a significant contributor to carrot germplasm collection. Here he's holding a very large umbel of a wild carrot in Tunisia in 2009. In addition to the U.S. or other international collaborators, there are always local experts who lead these collecting expeditions, whatever crop you're collecting. In the 1999, Bassam al-Safadi was a local collaborator here collecting some wild carrots in a rocky area. Selina Samaras from Greece, the local collaborator, and also Teresa Kotlinska from Poland, involved in the 1999 Greek collection. Here, looking at some wild carrots from along the roadside in Greece. And looking then at collecting in Turkey, where there's some abundant and very expansive germplasm for carrots. This is in Ephesus or Epes, Turkey, where we actually were touring the important historical site, but also there's wild carrots between those rocks. And we actually got some germplasm here with Teresa Kotlinska, again from Poland, who collaborated from the Polish side, but then the local collaborator, Ali Kuchuk, in 1999. In 2004, collected with Ferik Kazanov in Uzbekistan, with a local farmer here. The local collaborators always are great connections with the local farmers. So this is how we find out the best place to find some of these germplasm accessions. This is the collecting team in Tunisia 2009, myself, David Spooner in the middle, and the Tunisian collaborators, the other three people on this slide. In addition to collecting wild carrots in the countryside, an important place to find land races of vegetables is in local vegetable and produce markets where seed is being sold. So we got some cultivated land races carrots in Uzbekistan, 1989 in this market, in Turkmenistan also in 1989 in these markets. And along the way, we not only rely on the local collaborators from the countries that we're collecting with. These are typically plant scientists in their local research institutes or universities, but also we rely heavily on people we encounter on the expedition because they certainly know best where their local resources are to find the local plants, agriculture, and foods. One of the more exotic local groups we connected with in 1989 were some nomads in Tajikistan, living in yurts and leading their nomadic life, and pointing us to some sources of both wild carrots and wild garlic in that area. In the expedition 2007, some extension specialists in Tunisia helping us find this old elderly farmer to the right that had some landrace carrots that he shared some seed with us for. 1999 in Poland, where I don't speak any Polish but with Teresa Kotlinska, we connected with these women that were just happened to be sitting along the road, the village side, and talked about local seed that this one woman is reaching into the bag and sharing, and also this elderly couple that had seed that they were willing to share with us in this expedition. This is a Belarusian couple that was actually growing carrot seed in their backyard, Belarusian carrot that they had moved to Poland, and this is Teresa Kotlinska and them. In Uzbekistan, this is a local farmer that had both carrot and garlic, and garlic is shown in this picture, and she shared some seed with us. When we're collecting, sometimes the locals get involved. In this case, this guy to the right always kind of made me think he looked like Jack Black, but he had some wild garlic that he wanted to share with us. So he was there. There's always quite a bit of interest in sharing germplasm. One of the best places to collect germplasm is to come into a village around tea break time in the morning when the men are all sitting around and talking to each other, having tea in mid-morning. Women are probably at home working, but at least the men are talking around, and you can often find out about the local agriculture and strike up a conversation with them and find out who in the area might have some seed. This is in Konya, Turkey. This is in Acıpayam, Turkey. Also in 1999, another tea break where we're talking to some local farmers. And in this case, it's very interesting. One of those local farmers in Acıpayam, his mother had some carrot seed in the attic, and so he brought us to the house, and she was willing to share some seed with us and also with the local collaborator here, Ali Kuchuk, in the front. The son is the man with the white shirt in the middle on the left. And he said he wasn't growing any of these carrots anymore, but his mother retained this local cultivar, and we were lucky enough to be able to get some seed from them, which is really an interesting, great source of genetic diversity for our collections. So all these collections lead to this very extensive thing we call carrots. All of these are cultivated carrots, except for the one that's about 6 o'clock on this picture in the bottom, the smaller white carrot. A lot of diversity, and the wild relatives and this diverse cultivated germplasm is critically important for contributing to crop improvement. A few pictures of the sites of where wild carrots found here in Tunisia. You see some wild carrots in the background by this Jeep. When you're collecting carrots, you pack it in the back of a Jeep and drive around. This is a large population of wild carrots in a vacant lot in Portugal, 2001. Some wild carrots to the right here in Greece in 1999. Carrots are along the roadside around the world. And some more roadside wild carrots in Tunisia, 2009. And some sites where we did get some wild carrots at 4 different places in 1989 in Uzbekistan. So generally dry areas, but near some sources of water. This is Turkmenistan, 1989, another collecting area. There are quite a bit of diverse wild carrots. You can see a little bit towards the front and to the right near Konya, Turkey, in this vacant, never developed area. Very dry, but enough water to sustain the carrot population. And we collected germplasm there. This is Meteora region in Greece in 1999, Uzbekistan 2004 with a local farmer and Mike and Barbara Hellier and the local collaborator in this trip in this field where we found both wild carrot and wild garlic. And this is a wild carrot collecting site in Tunisia, 2009. Again, very dry, but enough water to sustain not only these palm trees and plants to the right, but some wild carrots. Some of the wild relatives of carrot are at the very edge of the Saharan desert near Tatooine, Tunisia. Tatooine, you may be familiar with the Star Wars films as the site for one scene, and we didn't go into the bar there, but it's the same town that was referred to in that movie. This is, again, another site near the edge of the Saharan desert where we collected this wild carrot that's a 9-chromosome carrot like carrot is, but it's a much smaller carrot, whereas a wild carrot will have a very large umbel. These umbels are no bigger than a 25-cent piece. You can see here in these pictures, you can see based on the Sharpie on the right, and they're growing in the sand. They're ephemerals. They grow and develop very quickly, and so we collected some germplasm from this Daucus hairensis as well. Another subspecies, this is Daucus gummifer subspecies along the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean, always within a couple kilometers of salt water, with Valerie Leclerc collecting some on the left. And in California, Docus pusillus occurs quite widely along some of the roadsides in the Central Valley of California. The collecting expedition always ends up with sharing half the seed with the local collaborators. Here's our the germplasm collaborators half in 2007 and 2009. And so in summary, I've given you a brief overview of carrots in history and history in carrots. Not a lot written history. Artworks contribute a lot to our understanding of carrots' origins. Molecular analysis has helped solve or at least address some of the problems. And the additional germplasm we collect has helped us better understand the domestication process, but also provides significant germplasm for carrot improvement as time goes along for current and future plant breeders. Germplasm collection is a very rewarding activity. If you're interested, I would encourage you to look into the possibility. It's rewarding to bring in the carrots, and in my case, but also very rewarding to have this traveling experience. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Susanna. Thank you very much for your time.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Simon. During this presentation, we've explored the history of carrots and global agricultural conservation practices that are still at work today. We've also learned the importance of ongoing plant breeding efforts. What we have revealed is some of the cultural history of carrots and of the plant breeding field. Now I'd like to take a few minutes to explore the culture of plant breeding through the lens of this Carrot Improvement for Organic Agriculture project. Now, culture is exceedingly difficult to define. Colloquially, we often use culture as a synonym for race, us versus them, frameworks, or to explore the other. Rather than utilize this framework or this definition, I define culture as a system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behaviors, artifacts, and institutions that are learned, shared, contested by a group of people. Culture is shaped by power dynamics. It is ever changing, and culture can be practiced. Today, we'll be looking in the mirror to identify some of the ways that culture has been practiced in this project. When selecting for taste, we're embodying a long-held tradition, a ritual of sorts. As humans, we bring our unique palettes, cultural symbolism, and color theory to the proverbial table. As Western scientists and farmers, we may attempt to use quantitative rankings or utilize qualitative descriptive sensory analysis to capture data that is both robust and easily analyzed. We utilize learned language like pithy, floral, bitter, pine-like to teach and describe a shared palette. These are all examples of cultural expression and how these expressions both relate, mingle, and also change. In this particular system, it's the plant breeder, and sometimes their funder, who has the power to set taste standards, who makes specific sensory experiences available to the general populace. The plant breeder embodies, reflects, and also introduces culture. While the plant breeder plays a pivotal role, the plant breeder is but one actor within larger cultural institutions. Cultural analysis and critique of these institutions have been extensively undertaken. Therefore, I'm not going to go into it. While the plant breeding field mirrors the cultural values and mores of Western neoliberalism, it is also a site of reimagination and critique of that very system. We see a cultural shift in power dynamics through participatory plant breeding projects, much like the CIOA project, which centers farmers and encourages multidisciplinary collaboration. Long-held beliefs about expertise are confounded by recognizing local farmers and seed keepers as subject matter experts and primary breeders. Often, cultural memory and taste are seen as important aspects of the selection process. Language continues to shift along with our understanding of how we relate to one another and to seed. And as our cultures continue to shift and morph, perhaps we humans are also acted upon in the plant improvement process. I wanted to give a brief overview of a cultural analysis of the plant breeding field. And I am very grateful to all the plant breeders who let me come and hang out with them and who participated in interviews and shared a little bit about their own lives and how they relate to plant breeding. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Susanna. We're going to move on to our Q&A, and I see some questions coming in already in the chat and in the Q&A box. So one of the first ones is wild carrot really native to all over the world, or did it spread to the United States, for example, by European settlers, or yeah, how did it get all over the world?
Well, we don't know how it got from Central Asia to Switzerland 5,000 years ago. Uh, if that was by humans or how, but the seed is spiny and carried readily by debris, by animals. Maybe that's how it spread, but it thought to have originated in Central Asia, and exactly how it got to where the places where it is now isn't exactly known. And I just give you that one example as the earliest carrots outside of Central Asia observed with seed found in Switzerland, Germany. U.S. carrot, I should say the north of the American carrots, both at least the North American carrots, have a DNA fingerprint very similar to European carrots. So it looks like the European settlers to the U.S. carried wild carrot seed in their stockings, maybe, or clothing, and there's no record of carrot widely being used in Native American writings for their multiple purposes. They use native foods that I've been able to find. So it's a crop that gets along very well with people, though. It's a wild
Okay.
relative.
Okay, that's great. All right, and then someone wanted to know whether Queen Anne's lace is edible.
It is. You want to eat, if you want to try and eat Queen Anne's lace, it is edible. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It's generally very strong flavored. There's a couple of chemicals that occur in it that are rare in cultivated carrots that are not particularly good for you, but it's probably not too unhealthy. But you're probably not going to eat much of it because it's very strong flavored. If you want to try and eat it, though, make sure it's before it starts flowering. Once carrot starts flowering, be it wild or cultivated, it's going to get very woody. So that's my advice if you want to eat some wild carrots.
Okay, good to know. Okay, so here's a question. Yeah, I really like this question because I've heard it before. Is it true that the prominence of orange carrots came about as a result of accolades for the Duke of Orange during the Napoleonic Wars? I know there's a lot of mythology about carrots floating around, so maybe you can clear it up.
Yeah, well, like all good mythology, it's hard to nail it down. I would say when carrots got to Holland, well, the Dutch have been famous throughout modern history for the development of agriculture, in particular, our so-called specialty crops, fruits and vegetables. And carrot is one example. It happened to match with some of the colors of some political activities in Holland, and that probably accelerated the process. And so they've really been great promoters of carrots, historically speaking. To answer your question specifically, don't know.
Just
Okay.
to add on to that,
Yeah.
Alice,
Mhm.
when I was studying public education and carrots, I found that that particular story came up more than any other carrot story. And it's interesting. It came up all over social media, and many people would take it and use it as a way of explaining carrots and some history. So whether it's true or not, it does get plenty of attention.
Okay. Let's see. I know you've been breeding lots of different color carrots, and we saw some pictures of those. And so Frida here wanted to know whether or not there are any pink colored carrots.
I guess you could consider pink to be a color of a very dilute purple carrot or a very dilute red carrot. Haven't got that question has come up. We haven't got any carrots that what I would consider would be reliably pink, or another term might be true breeding, meaning it's been a trait that we haven't fixed in any genetic stocks. We run into periodic pink roots, haven't really produce seed on them to have a sustainable source of pink carrots. But you too can breed carrots, so go for it.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. What are the health benefits of carotene or carrots in general? And I know you've been breeding carrots with not only beta carotene, but other nutrients as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. I got interested in the colors primarily as genetic markers early in my career, but it turned out that these colors are very important pigments for human health. The purple pigments are great antioxidants, and the carrots have the dark purple carrots have a lot of anthocyanins, which are those purple pigments, and so. That's one health aspect, that antioxidant capacity, which helps sequester some of the more negative compounds that show up in our diet and in our bloodstreams. So that's with the purple color. The red carrots, the consumption of that red pigment in red carrots, red now, not purple, but red, is lycopene, which is the same pigment as in red tomatoes and in watermelon. And lycopene is higher lycopene consumption is associated with a greater reduction or lower incidence of some forms of cancer. Yellow carrots contain lutein. That lutein is you'll find in some vitamins for eye health to help prevent macular degeneration. So yellow carrots provide that. And the most important compound is actually a vitamin source. Is provitamin A is beta carotene, and carrots are the most abundant source of beta carotene in the U.S. diet by far. And that beta carotene is a 40 carbon molecule of beta carotene. That molecule is broken down into 2 molecules of vitamin A when we eat that orange pigment, and so it's a vitamin A source in the form of that orange beta carotene pigment. So all the compounds have some positive health benefits.
Okay, great. Let's see. If carrot traits are influenced by human culture, what do you think are the newer traits that are being prized among breeders and culinary professionals today? I know you just mentioned all the different nutrients that are in carrots.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's the first part of the question, but the second part is when does productivity have to take a hit before other traits are favored?
Mm. It's hard to explain or predict or exactly what is going to drive the development of new products. Something like baby carrots, some people don't like them, but they account for about half of the raw carrots that we eat today. And they were initially developed as a way for the orange carrot growers to use some of the broken carrots. And what are we going to do instead of throw these things away? Well, let's make baby carrots. And now they're nearly half of the raw carrot production in the U.S. So looking at that particular product, the convenience is obviously what drives it. So I guess people view cutting up a carrot and peeling it as a big job. So that's one driving force. The novel colors are in some ways attractive depending on the person. In some cases, people wouldn't touch a purple carrot because that's, quote, not the right color for carrots, unquote. But many people will try them. And in the end, it's probably going to depend in a lot of ways more than what the consumer may be originally thinking about, but rather how does it taste or how does it work in their food use. If it's very nutritious or looks very interesting but doesn't taste good, it's not likely that they're going to continue to eat it. So I would say if you're looking to market something new, for carrots, make sure it tastes good, like the pink one maybe.
Okay, let's see. This is interesting. Okay, Michael here just posted a link to some GMO pink carrots that contain shrimp or flamingo carotenoid pigments.
Yeah.
I'm allergic to shrimp, so I don't know if I could eat those, but
Yeah.
they're
Well,
interesting.
thanks, Michael. I
Yeah,
appreciate your input on this.
interesting.
Yeah, Michael
Wow.
works. Michael works in my lab, so it's good to
Okay.
learn about this. But yeah, I'm not surprised. Yeah, there's a fair bit of work looking at some of these editing products. But
Okay, let's see. We got a question from Luke here. I was curious about the different biochemical components to the wonderfully strong aromatic of organically grown carrots. It is true when you pull a fresh carrot out of the ground. They are delicious.
Well, I would guess it's some of the same compounds as what are the primary ones of the thing we call carrot flavor, which are volatile, um, so 10 and 15 carbon molecules that some of the same compounds as in pine sap. Obviously, those may not be viewed as very positive, but maybe in small doses, it does give you some of that aromatic quality of that freshly pulled organic carrot. So those compounds again are in resin ducts in all carrot roots, and when you pull a carrot, you're going to break off some of the small roots and release some of those compounds, and that's, I'm guessing, where that comes from primarily. But to answer the question specifically, I don't know if there's been anybody specifically looking at that.
Hmm. Okay, here's a really interesting question. Are the presenters familiar with the traditional usage of carrot seeds as herbal birth control taken daily orally with cumulative potency, inhibiting the implantation of an egg into the uterine wall? Let's see, this is from Heron, who learned about this from his mother, who was a midwife and herbalist for 50 years, aka a wit. As one thinks of the seed gathering from local patches, the gatherers, likely women, would notice unique flowering plants among the populations. And he's noticed that domesticated carrots have very unique floral and foliage stem traits from standard wild carrots. He's imagined these seed gatherers selecting these unique flowering individuals and establishing home patches and finding the unique root colors as results. These collectors may be sharing the unique plants and seeds with others as gifts and in exchange. So lots of extrapolation here in this question, but very interesting question in general. Are you at all familiar with this?
I am, but I'll ask you, Susanna, are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I am. I feel like I think that the practice of using seeds as abortive or preventative medicine is fairly common. What I would say, it's having talked to a couple of herbalists about this, they always suggest that one practices caution, and that they speak with a herbalist to learn exactly how one might go about using this method, and the dosage. And so I would just say please exercise caution. And yes, this is a very, very old remedy for birth.
Um, my connection with that question was with a physician in New York State that was interacting with some local women and asking about this. And my involvement was primarily to say, yes, that is wild carrot, because that's what they were wondering. And exactly what the whole process was beyond that, I'm not sure, but it tells me that it's a practice that, as the questioner no doubt knows, is still being evaluated and used potentially as in the methods that you've described.
Okay. Do the other colors than orange taste different?
Well, orange carrots don't all taste the same, and likewise, not these so-called, not what I call novel colors, because orange isn't so novel anymore. These novel colors have a wide range of flavor. Uh, when you're tasting these purple, especially purple, but also yellow, red, and white carrots, those are carrots that have been primarily, in most cases, developed from these land races or heirloom cultivars. A lot of these carrots were not used as for fresh market consumption. In fact, if you go to Asia, especially for the older generation folks, I've been told, there's not much consumption of raw carrots. And so what that means is if you're getting a red carrot from Japan, for instance, that's primarily used for cooking, and you eat it as a raw carrot in U.S., it might have a very strong flavor, and some, in fact, do. But the bottom line is there's no association at all between color and flavor in any genetic way. It's just The purple carrots that are used to create the newer purple carrots today, come from a certain genetic background that tend to have a stronger flavor. So unless the breeder is working hard to select for a better flavor, you can select for the carrot the flavor you're looking for, but it's a longer process to get there. And these novel colors are all newer to us.
Yeah, that's what you mentioned before, because we were talking about, the crunchy orange bunching type carrots that are often sold, and how a lot of the colored carrots aren't quite the same in terms of their flavor and texture, just because the orange carrots have been bred with so much hard work for such a long time. So
Yeah,
the colored ones are a little bit later
yeah,
in terms of that type of breeding. So.
yeah,
Uh, but that's really interesting that some of them are eaten as cooked carrots in other places, and so they might not have the same
right.
flavor and texture profile. So here's a good cautionary comment here. If you're eating wild carrots, be sure you're not eating poison hemlock. They resemble one
Yes,
another closely, and there have been cases of poisoning and death. So that's a very important comment.
yes.
Thank you very much, Beth. So
Yep.
um, let's see. And then another comment is from Petra that yellow carrots can taste somewhat like parsnip. So
Mm.
another comment here, wild carrots seem to thrive in difficult environments, roadsides, low water, between rocks and vacant lots. Is there anything we can learn or apply from wild carrots to make growing cultivated carrots easier?
Mm. Probably so. And the reason I say this is we've got some studies underway with some collaborators looking at wild carrots that I collected from all these regions that were noted. All those collections have a GPS associated with them, and so with enough global weather information, the climatic or at least the typical growing conditions of those specific carrot growing sites are known. And there's some studies underway suggesting that one can have some level of predictivity of, for instance, drought tolerance if it's a
Mm,
wild carrot that came from an area where there's not as much water. So to go to the question, yes, I think that there is something to be learned in this type of an analysis.
okay, great. Let's see. Have you noticed soil health having an influence on the quality of carrots and how they manifest genetic qualities?
Um, it's hard to know what soil health might be. Something like organic versus conventional might be considered contrasts in soil health. We don't see significant differences in a given climatic area. Let's say some adjacent fields where one's organic and one's conventional. We don't see much impact of the management practices on flavor. Certainly in different locations, there's significant differences in carrot flavor. In general, California, in fact, is a rather optimal place to be growing carrots, which is actually where most of our fresh market carrots are grown for wide scale production. Uh, Certainly not the small scale organic growers, but for the big growers, they're primarily California. But in terms of soil health, I guess probably cultivation is a significant part of getting good quality carrots. I would say if the soil health is such that the carrot is stressed, generally a stressed carrot doesn't taste as good. I think some of those stronger flavor compounds become more pronounced. But other than that, I can't reflect on too much on that question. Not a bad question, but haven't seen
Okay.
much association.
Yeah, I think they meant the microbiology in the soil,
Yeah.
whether that has
So
any effect. Mm,
And so, yeah, we have had some microbiome, both endophytic microbial evaluation and rhizosphere variation, and those can have some impact on carrot production. We didn't see a significant effect on flavor in those studies where we looked at it, but it's not been an area where there's a lot of data yet.
okay. Okay, so you were just saying that California is the optimum place to grow carrots, but Barbara here is asking why the locally grown carrots, wherever she is, taste so much better than the ones shipped from California. They may be fresher,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah,
But
I think they're fresher, and that goes a long way. And I don't mean to disparage any local production at all. I'm just saying that if you're looking at where most consumers get most of their carrots, it is in the big chain grocery stores. The interesting thing with carrots is the California growers can grow the same amount of carrots every week of the year, and for a big chain grocery store, that's important. If you're a local farmer and you're selling in your local market, you just say, well, this is the season for the good carrots, and that in fact is the case for many of these local productions.
Okay, yeah, and I guess we had one more question earlier that I made an attempt to answer myself, and I know I think it was Angie also tried to answer it, but it was about what a landrace is,
Hmm.
and I had said it was a local population that's adapted over time, and that it might contain more diversity than, say, a modern cultivated variety. But if you have anything to add about
Yeah.
what that is,
Yeah, some
yeah.
of them are quite unique. I think the term initially was used for swine, but at any rate, it's used widely for animals and plants at this time. And it just refers to, like you had said, you hit the nail on the head. It's a local cultivar that hasn't been widely grown beyond that area that we know of.
Okay. Well, I think that's about it for the questions, but I just want to know if either of you has anything else to add. I know that was a fantastic journey around the world there looking, or at least parts of the world, looking at carrot germplasm. And Susanna really offered some interesting thoughts about plant breeding in general. And I know she's collected a lot of carrot stories in her work
Yeah.
as both for the Organic Seed Alliance and as an anthropologist. So, is there anything else you want to just say at the very end here? Otherwise,
Well,
yeah.
I from my standpoint, I just encourage people to consider looking at collecting germplasm, be it just as a hobby, or if you're a dedicated botanist or agriculturist that is interested in a specific crop. It's a very interesting thing. It's quite insightful for crop improvement to see the production of your crop that you're familiar with in your setting, how it's grown, how it's used, how the local people around the world talk about that crop. It's very, very insightful.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil. And thank you, Susanna. And thanks to everyone who who asked great questions here. And like I said, the recording will be available within the coming week on the eOrganic YouTube channel and on our website. And I also wanted to just remind, or I didn't say this before, but the carrot improvement for organic agriculture project has a website if you want to learn more about that, and that's at eorganic.info/carrot improvement. And so you can hear more about the work that Phil has been up to lately in terms of breeding organic carrots. So thank you very much.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
Thanks,
rest
Very
of the
much
day.
Phil.
appreciated.
Okay.
Yep. Bye-bye.